It's time to talk about the properties of quadrilaterals. We're going to finish our notes on the foldable that I had you made in class. So on the foldable, you have a section for 6 different quadrilaterals. And each one, you've got the front of the paper. That's where you're going to talk about the information about the sides of that quadrilateral. Behind on the back of the flap, that's where you're going to talk about the information about the angles. And then on the paper under the flap, you're going to talk about the diagonals. And then you should have pasted in the figure next to the notes. The order doesn't really matter. Just put it in the order that you have it pasted into your notebook. Might be different than the order on these notes, but that's okay. So the first quadrilateral is a parallelogram. And so the information about the sides is going to be, first of all, that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So that means that this side, AD, is parallel to BC. And DC is parallel to AB. So this is how you notate parallel sides on your picture. You might want to add that to the picture that's in your notes. You want to be sure to recognize that this indicates that they are parallel. The other information that you're going to want to put on the sides is that each side is congruent. So AD is congruent to BC and CD is congruent to AB. So when we put these little tick marks, and there's one tick mark here and one here, that means that this line is congruent to this line. So again, the opposite sides are congruent. So the information on the sides would include both of these. Now the other thing that we know is the angles. The angles are congruent, the opposite angles. So that means that angle D and angle B are congruent, and angle C and angle A are congruent. So under angles, you're going to want to note that the opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent, and that these consecutive angles are supplementary. So if you recall, supplementary means that they add up to be 180 degrees. So supplementary indicates that they're 180 degrees. So that means that angle C plus angle D would equal 180. So on your notes about angles for parallelograms, the opposite angles are congruent and the consecutive angles are supplementary. We would add these two together, and that means that they are 180. And then the last thing is the diagonals right here. And what it's saying is the diagonals will bisect each other. So if we're looking at a diagonal from A to C would be one of your diagonals, and from D to B would be the other one. And if they bisect each other, that means that this line is congruent to this line, and this line segment is congruent to this line segment. That is what it means by bisecting. So the things on the diagonals for a parallelogram is just going to be that the diagonals will bisect each other. So those are the notes for the parallelogram. We're going to move on to another figure, but if you still need some more time to write this down, then go ahead and pause the video and start it back up when you're ready. The next one we're looking at is a rhombus, and that's a special quadrilateral. You'll notice all of these are quadrilateral, but this one, for the sides, all 4 sides are congruent. So this side, this side, this side, and this side all are the same. Now, the rest of the properties that related to the sides of a parallelogram are also the same. So the notes you have from the parallelogram will also continue into the rhombus. So you're going to want to copy those in. Now, the diagonals will also continue. So the diagonals, when you make them, they're going to bisect each other because that's a property of the parallelogram, and it's the same for the rhombus. But in addition to just that they bisect each other, they also bisect the angles. So whatever this angle is, the diagonal will bisect it, and so that means half of the angle is here and half is here. And the same thing for each of the other ones. So when you're talking about diagonals, you're going to want to add the property that the diagonal bisects the angles. And the other thing is that the diagonals are perpendicular, which means they're going to make a 90 degrees, which was not the case for a parallelogram. So for rhombus, you're going to have the same properties as you had on the parallelogram. You're going to want to copy those in, and then you're going to want to add the fact that the four sides are congruent and that the diagonals bisect not only each other in having congruent sides, but they bisect the angles and that they are perpendicular. So make sure you have all of those notes. If you need more time, just pause the video and then continue when you're ready. The next one we have is a parallelogram, and a parallelogram has four right angles. So each one of these are 90 degrees. And they can be drawn this way, or sometimes only one of them is marked as a rectangle, as a right angle. But that doesn't mean that they're not all right angles, because if you look at the properties of a parallelogram, opposite angles are congruent. So if one angle is written as 90 degrees, the opposite angle has to be 90 degrees. And then the other property, angle property of a parallelogram, was that the consecutive angles added up to be 180. So if one of the angles is 90, the other angle has to be 90 to add up to be 180 degrees. So under angles, you might want to make a special note after you've copied your properties over from the parallelogram, is that they are all right angles, all 90 degrees, and that if one is marked, then the rest are also 90 degrees. And then when you do the diagonals for a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent. So that means that instead of just bisecting, which they'll still bisect, because that's a property of a parallelogram, and these will be the same, but they'll also be the fact that they will be congruent. So this diagonal here is congruent to this diagonal here. So JL is congruent to MK. And that would be something you need to note under your diagonals, in addition to the other properties of the parallelogram. So when you do your notes, we've got the parallelogram, you're going to copy them over onto the rectangle, the same properties, as well as these additional ones that we have to write for a rectangle. So if you need to pause the video so that you can write those notes down, go ahead and pause now, and then we'll continue when you're ready. So the next quadrilateral is a square. So we're still dealing with the parallelogram, but it has four congruent sides now, so that's kind of similar to the rhombus. It has all the properties of a parallelogram, a rhombus, and a rectangle. So for the square, you're going to want to look back at those properties that you've written in each one of these, and all of those need to be carried over onto the square. And then you're going to want to add that the sides, for the sides, they're congruent, and then for the angles, they're all right angles, or all 90 degrees. The diagonals are again congruent, so we'll do our diagonal again, and we're going to go N to P and Q to O, and so we're going to say that NP is congruent to QO, all right, and it's perpendicular. So again, you've got your 90 degrees all the way around. So for diagonals, you're going to add that the diagonals are congruent and perpendicular, and that they bisect the opposite angles. So that means if you have your diagonal going through here, that bisects those two angles, and they also bisect each other, all right? So, and if they're congruent, then each one of these are actually the same. So I really should make this, we'll fix that. These should actually all be the same because they're all going to bisect. So here's the ones you're going to add for the diagonals, these three. You're going to still do your properties of these. They're going to be added onto the square. And then you've got your four congruent sides and four right angles. So make sure you get all of those properties written down. You probably want to stop the video and get those written down. And then you can come back and start again. All right, so we're almost done. We have two more. The trapezoid is a little bit different. It still has four sides, but it only has on the sides one pair of parallel sides, okay? So on the sides part of your notes, you're going to want to write that there are one pair of parallel sides. These are called the bases. So this would be a base. This would be a base. All right. And then the non-parallel sides are your legs. So this would be a leg, and this would be a leg. Now the base and one of the legs, they form the base angle. So this is a base angle. All right. So if the legs are congruent, then you have a special case. So if RU is congruent to ST, then this would be considered an isosceles. RU is congruent to ST. It makes this an isosceles trapezoid. And that just means that you've got two sides that are the same. So if it's an isosceles trapezoid, then you have a couple of special conditions. Number one, the diagonals would be congruent and the angles would be congruent. So on your notes for the angles, you're going to write if it's isosceles, then the angles are congruent. Make sure you make a note of that. And on the diagonals, if it's an isosceles, then you're going to want to write that the diagonals are also congruent. So, and you want to be sure and note that in order for it to be isosceles, the legs must be congruent. So you would write this on the sides part of your notes. This would go on the diagonals portion of your notes. And this would go on the angles portion of your notes. Okay? In your picture, you might want to note some of this vocabulary so you know what a base is considered and what a leg and the base angle are considered. You'll need to know those, and you might have those on your quiz, so be sure and write those down. Again, if you need more time, just stop the video and start it back up when you're ready. All right, our last one is our kite. And so the kite is just another quadrilateral, 4 sides, but instead of them all being the same, 2 pairs of the sides are congruent. So this is congruent to this, and this one is congruent to this one. No opposite sides are congruent. So KE is not congruent to IT. Only the adjacent sides. So be sure and make a note of this in your sides portion of your notes. And then the diagonals, which we've got drawn here, are perpendicular. All right, so they still intersect at a 90 degrees. So this should be on your notes for your diagonals. All right. The other things about the angles and would still be the same. So the opposites are the same. All right. If you have anything, questions on that, we'll talk about it a little bit more in class. But these are the main 2 things for a kite. To remember the right angles and which sides are congruent. So those should fill in your foldable. You're going to have a quiz on that in class. You'll have the notes. You'll be able to use your notes. And then you're going to be able to use your notes on your test. So make sure you get these down. You're going to need them. I will collect the notebooks on the day of the test so that we can get that final grade into the grade book for your notes. And I will see you in class.